CPI numbers this week. I must say, going back to March of last year, you said that they've made the biggest fiscal blunder in 40 years, and inflation would be the result. Boy, we're having it. But were even you surprised by the level of these CPI numbers?
I think today's numbers surprised most observers. I'm not sure it should have. It's pretty clear that peak inflation theory, like transitory inflation theory, is kind of wrong. And it's wrong. You see it in the overall numbers, and you also see it in the pervasiveness of the components. Almost everything is up significantly, and my guess is that there's some major components that are actually going to accelerate in the months ahead. I think the shelter component is going to be rising at 8% a year by the end of this year. If you look at all the private sector indices like Zillow, they're going up much faster than that. If you look at the inflation numbers, medical care is still looking low. I don't know what that number means. Every time I talk to anybody in medical care, there's a desperate nursing shortage. There's a huge backlog of elective procedures. So I think that number's going to be going up. So I think we've built ourselves a stagflationary kind of situation, and as I've been saying for months now, I think a soft landing's not going to be easy.
What about the core versus headline?
The core is below the headline, but the core this month, which was supposed to be one of the good months, was at an annual rate of close to 7.5%. So that's nowhere near an acceptable level. And I think the Fed's forecast from March saying that inflation would be coming down to the twos by the end of the year was frankly delusional when issued, and looks even more ridiculous today.
So let's talk about the Fed for a minute. President Biden has made it clear he thinks this job is first and foremost one for the Fed. Most would agree with him. What should the Fed do in response to these kinds of numbers? Let me be very direct with you. Emergency rate hike, should that be on the table?
I think an emergency rate hike a week before a meeting would look panicked and is an unwise strategy. I think the deliberation has been between 25 and 50 basis point moves a couple months from now. I think a more fruitful deliberation would be between 50 and 75 basis points. I don't think anybody thinks that we're going to get out of this without interest rates being significantly higher than they are right now, Fed funds rates. And I don't know what the advantage of delay in raising the Fed funds rate is. And I think given that monetary policy acts on the economy with a significant lag, there's some real disadvantages to delay. So I'd like to see the process be carried forward with a lot of energy and determination. The Fed is saying the right words, but I think they don't appreciate the extent to which, given the mistakes they made through last year and even into the early part of this year, I don't think they appreciate the extent to which those mistakes mean that they don't fundamentally have credibility.
So, Larry, picking up on that, what would indicate to you that the Fed does, if I can put it in the vernacular, get it? I mean, should there be changes in personnel? Should there be a difference in the overall approach to the Fed? Do we need to know what went wrong?
I'd like to see much more effort at understanding why their forecasts were so dramatically wrong and have been so repeatedly wrong. It's true, as they will be quick to point out, that often they have echoed the consensus of professional forecasters or whatever, but this is the fundamental responsibility of the Fed. I think the Furbus model, which is at the center of their academic process, their economic forecasting process, that's the FRB US model, is not really fit for purpose in terms of inflation. I think they need a different approach. I think that successful organizations have substantial ranges of viewpoint that are debated and synthesized. What you have to be struck by whenever you look at the dot plot is how much homogeneity there is across all the people at the Fed who are thinking about the economic outlook. I think you do have to ask, why do these mistakes keep being made?
Larry, in addition to the CPI numbers this week, we also got University of Michigan consumer sentiment numbers out, which were at a record low. The lowest it's been, 50.8 was the index. The lowest it's been since they started doing this back in 1978, which is basically when I was in law school, frankly. So what's the significance of that potentially? And I want to tie it back, if I can, to stagflation, because my understanding is economists tell us one of the issues of stagflation is when the expectations are there will be continued inflation, and the driver primarily of that low UMich consumer sentiment was the expectation of inflation.
Look, it can't be good. I'm not sure how well you can compare those numbers over time. It's sort of a surlier time, and people are more disgruntled in general. You know, sentiment may be maybe the lowest it's ever been, but that's not true, certainly of spending behavior. But look, it's a clear negative indicator, and it goes with what I've been saying, which is I think everybody's got to be anticipating that we're going to not have inflation come down extremely rapidly, and we're going to enter into a period of substantially more sluggishness. That's what stagflation is, poor growth and problematic inflation performance. And I fear that that's what's ahead of us, given the supply shocks we have suffered, and given that we experienced those supply shocks after we had very substantially overheated the economy because of the policy errors of 2021.
Larry, let's finish this week with a couple of rapid fire, one of which is Lina Khan, the chair of the FTC. We've talked before about what you described as hipster antitrust. We saw her interviewed by the Financial Times this week. She went after private equity very explicitly, and a lot of the criticisms were not so much about the economics as the conditions of workers in companies that are bought by private equity. What do you make of what she's saying?
That's not her job. Her job is competition. Competition between companies, and making sure that it's robust. It's not to pass judgment on who the owners of the companies are. I was very sorry to see that. Frankly, a lot of her writings were quite problematic, but many had assured us that her deeds were going to be reasonable and provide the new rejuvenation that antitrust represented. That interview seemed to me to be back to academic populism of a quite unfortunate sort.
And finally, Larry, you have a long and very distinguished curriculum vitae. And included in that, of course, is president of Harvard. Now we see Harvard is going to be looking for a new president. By the way, joining Columbia and MIT and NYU, there are a lot of big institutions of higher learning looking for presidents. It was never an easy job. How much harder is it today than it was, say, 20 years ago?
I think it's probably harder given all that has to be navigated, all the various social revolutions we're having. But I think it's much more important, because I think there's never been a moment when ideas and bringing forth new leaders has been more important. And I think the centerpiece, seeking truth through open debate, committed to the most excellent scholars pursuing the best ideas. I think all of that is, frankly, under challenge on our college campuses in a way that it has not been in many years. And so I hope the new generation of presidents is going to rise to that challenge of truth-seeking and excellence at a moment when there's a lot of turbulence and a lot of forces at play.